Hello everybody. The official title of my talk is quite a mouthful. So I will talk to you about RTI, which is a novel fisheries management approach that I have been developing over the years, together with the co-authors who are listed here. But what is RTI? Well, the acronym stands for Real-Time Incentives. In 2012, we published a Food for Thought paper where we outlined the concept of RTI. RTI is an innovative instrument for fisheries management that would replace catch or landings quotas and days at sea limitation, and can at the same time incorporate closed areas, whether permanent, seasonal or real-time, in one single management measure. Basically, each fisher gets an individual allocation of fishing impact credits. We call them RTIs, for example 200 per year. With those, the fisher can fish when and where he wants, as long as he pays according to spatio-temporally varying tariffs that are displayed on maps such as this one. The managers will set the tariffs according to their objectives. They will set high tariffs, for example of 5 RTIs per day in the red cells, where they want to discourage fishing, for example because in that cell the catchability is high of the species of which the fishing mortality needs to be limited. In other cells the tariffs can be quite low, such as 0.1 or 0.5 in the white and yellow cells respectively. In those cells fishing is encouraged, for example because the catchability of the vulnerable species is low there. In our proposal, the tariffs would be set based on relative CPUE levels of the relevant species. For example, if we consider cod only, which is a choke species whose fishing mortality needs to be restricted, we can set the tariffs according to the relative CPUE levels. Where catch rates are high, impact of fishing on the stock is high, and tariffs should be high. Where catch rates are low and the fishermen target something else, fishing does not impact the cod stock very much, so tariffs can be low, because there the costs to the stock are low, so to say. If the costs to a vulnerable bycatch species needs to be considered in addition, for example vulnerable elasmobranchs, the distribution of their discard rates can be used to modify the tariffs. This can be done, but it doesn't have to be done like that, by simple superposition. Wherever discard rates are medium-high, the tariffs become red, and where they are very high, black, which is closed. Another feature of the RTI system is that the tariff maps are gear-specific. And when someone fishes with a selective gear, for example with one for which it has been proven by a scientific study that it lets most cod escape, the fisherman can have a much easier tariff map with most of the area white or yellow, so that he can fish year-round almost everywhere. Now, one last feature of RTI is that the tariffs can be updated at any timescale you wish. For example, weekly by real-time information, just as with real-time closures. This way, the tariffs always reflect the actual distribution, that is, to the extent that last week's cell abundance is predictive of this week's. Historical information on seasonality can be used to update the tariff maps as well. Okay, so how would it work in practice? One of our co-authors, Amos Barkai, has a company that produces software for electronic logbooks, and he is developing a customization of his software to handle the needs for RTI. We have written an ICES paper about it. Fishers would have a unit on board on which they can see the tariff maps integrated with the e-log software, where they can log all other information, and he would see his balance of RTIs left and how many fishing days he would have left if he continues to fish at the current rate, and RTIs would be automatically deducted from his account based on his position, which would be sent to the on unit. The algorithms for calculating real-time tariffs would be largely automatic, but managers should still be able to make ad hoc decisions, and they should also respond to requests of skippers when they want to be allocated a different map, when they start using a different gear, etc. Okay, we used a simulation framework to explore the dynamics of the system. I'm not going to talk you through the details of the model, and this flowchart is only here for illustration. It suffices to say that it is an abstract model. It does not mimic actual species or management areas. Some people call this a toy model. It's meant to be as simple as possible to investigate the features of interest. The version of RTI I explored follows a particular automatic algorithm for tariff setting. In fact, two different algorithms at two different timescales. One algorithm is how to update the tariffs within year based on real-time information. Each week, the CPUEs for each cell would be calculated based on electronic logbook information and VMS. Tariffs of cells would go up or down if the CPUE of that cell relative to the mean of that week was higher or lower than last week. The other algorithm is just like the annual harvest control rules we are used to. If we find out from an annual stock assessment that the fishing mortality on the stock was higher or lower than the agreed target, the overall level of tariffs becomes more or less restrictive. The harvest control rule I investigated specified that the tariffs would only change if the F was more than 10% different from the target, and in that case the tariffs would all become 10% more or less stringent. So both algorithms are in force, but operate at different timescales. Our first simulation study has been published already. In it, we challenged the system and found that it is robust to tactical fisher behavior, at least under the model assumptions. Even if fishers initially increased their efficiency, and even if fishers misreported their catches tactically to different cells, the harvest control rule brought the F to within the 10% bounds of the target within a few years. Next, we investigated how the system works with multiple species. For example, if a mixed fishery has to be managed where one species chokes the fishery, and if, in addition to 3 commercial species, the impact on a vulnerable bycatch species needs to be managed as well. The tariffs were based on the CPUEs of all 4 species according to a specific algorithm. Let me explain what happens from right to left. The scenario on the right is traditional TAL, total allowable landings, the system we have or had before the landings obligation. If species 1, the blue one, is the choke species, but fishers are allowed to continue fishing until they caught all their quotas, in this case species 2, the red one, would be the last one, and they would discard their over quota catches, then this is what happens. About 35% of over quota catches for the choke species, and also about 10% of over quota catches for species 3, the green one. With a real TAC or catch quota system, the scenario in the middle, where fishers have to stop fishing as soon as their first quota has been caught, species 1 is so much choking the fishery that fishers will be unable to catch their other quotas, resulting in 45% and almost 30% of undercatching of species 2 and 3 respectively. The simulated scenario of RTI on the left results in undercatching of all species. For species 4, the purple one, which is the vulnerable bycatch which had no TAC or TAL in the other scenarios, this is no problem. The lower catches, the better. Species 2 and 3 are undercaught to a much lesser extent than under the TAC system, the degree to which is about halved. And the choke species is a little bit undercaught, and certainly not overcaught as under the total allowable landing system. So in these tests, RTI comes out as the superior system, performing better than TAC, TAL, and also effort management, which is not shown here. Because we only provide the concept, but all the details of the implementation need to be filled in, RTI is very amenable to bottom-up designing with fishermen. This has two advantages. One is to gain buy-in from the fishing industry, and the other is to learn about case-specific conditions that are relevant to the RTI implementation. Dave Reed and I have had extensive discussions with Irish fishermen, starting in 2011-2012, which resulted that by 2014 they felt ownership of the system and want to run a pilot. Questions considered were: how many RTIs does each individual skipper get? Equal numbers? Based on historical track record? Do inshore fisheries also fall under the RTI system? Do small boats get a lower RTI allowance, or should they get a higher allowance? This is an important one. Do they pay RTIs while they are steaming, or only when they are fishing? In the first instance, they said only when fishing, and not when steaming, for example, through an expensive rectangle. But when you discuss with them how this should be verified, they become more sympathetic to the idea that all activity should count, and that the RTI allocations and tariffs are adjusted to account for this fact. How is the initial map set up? Based on scientific data only, or also based on industry perception? Or include the wishes of environmental NGOs as well? These are important ones. The fishers don't like too fine scales. If they are confronted with different maps every week, planning becomes difficult. And also when the grid cells are so small that within one hole one crosses more than one grid cell. But the advantage of fine scale is of course the fine-tuning of the tariffs. At coarser scales, the tariffs must be set at higher levels because within a cell or time step, the realized catchability may be at the higher end of the range. Our fishers were not sure what the optimal scales should be and want to test this in a pilot. Further issues were the gear-specific maps and the burden of proof. How must fishers prove that they fish more selectively? And what if it is not a gear, but a fishing practice, such as targeting and avoidance, that is more selective? The most rewarding for us was when fishers came up with innovative solutions to problems they perceived. A brilliant solution was given by one fisher, which we now call the golden cell. The fishers feared that precisely those grid cells where they prefer to fish would always be red. Then this fisher proposed that each individual fisher can choose one favorite cell and have a reduced tariff in that cell. So each fisher would have his own golden cell with reduced tariff. This is a brilliant way to increase contentment among fishers. The overall setting of the tariffs will absorb the costs or impacts resulting from this. But each individual fisherman will experience a greater contentment when fishing at half tariff in his golden cell. Okay, that's it. Thank you for your attention. And if you want to know more, we have a lot of information at our website rtiforfisheries.info.